of you and your love and your grace. I pray for those who are not feeling well this morning. I pray for those who are sick, grieving because of lost loved ones. I pray that you will bring your healing in each of these situations. Bring your special grace. Meet them in the moment. Let them know how much you love them. I pray for those who are not yet aware how much you love them, not aware of your grace, not aware of your forgiveness. I pray that you will use us even this week as agents of your kindness, agents of your grace, agents of your forgiveness, even agents of reconciliation. In a world that is screaming at each other, I pray that we will be people of peace. That in those moments that we will have on our lips the grace, the mercy, and love of Jesus. And that we're able to speak into those kinds of situations and bring healing for our neighbors. I thank you for all that you are doing here at the table. Continue to use us to talk about your good news here in our great city. Thank you for what you're doing for the table, to the table, and through the table. In your name I pray. Amen.
Restore
In our Bible binge, we have come to the book of Daniel. Daniel's a very interesting book. We're going to talk a little bit about it this morning. But Daniel actually has two of the more famous Bible stories that we know. One of which we're going to look at this morning. Henry's going to read the back end of the story. We'll get into all this other stuff that's going on, but Henry's going to read our portion of the text this morning.
Nebuchadnezzar asked them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I've set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyra, harp, drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I made. But if you don't worship it, you will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of the blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he doesn't not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue. And on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave orders to the heat of the furnace 7 times more than was customary. And he commanded some of the best soldiers in the army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So these men, in their trousers, robes, head coverings, and other clothes, were tied up and thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Since the king commanded was so urgent, and the furnace extremely hot, the raging flames killed those men who carried out Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. The king Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, Didn't we throw these 3 men bound into the fire? Yes, of course, Your Majesty, they replied to the king. He exclaimed, Look, I see 4 men not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of the blazing fire and called, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, your servants of the Most High God, come out. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. When the satraps, perfect governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their robes were unaffected, and there were no smell of the fire on them. Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's commands and risked their own lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God.
So earlier this summer, a fire broke out in a 3-story home in Everett, Massachusetts. There were 2 city workers nearby, and these 2 city workers ran into the burning house, and into the fire. They tried to get everybody out. They were told there's one more person in there, a 3-year-old girl. They tried to go up the stairs to the 3-year-old girl, but they were turned back because the fire was so bad. A couple of minutes later, there was a fire chief that showed up, and a firefighter goes into the house, goes to the 3rd floor, and rescues the 3-year-old girl. He brings the girl out. She's unconscious. He collapses. They both go to the hospital, both with lives that have been saved. They both survive. That firefighter was a hero. And those are stories that we like to tell because that's what firefighters are supposed to do, right? When your lives are on the line, you expect someone to go into the fire to rescue you or somebody you love at the risk of their health and their life. Now that's a rescue from a fire. Our story today is slightly different. It involves a rescue, but it's not a rescue from the fire, it's a rescue in the fire. And we're going to look at that this morning. We're in a new book in our Bible binge as we're reading book by book, and hopefully you have your little bookmarks. We still got some bookmarks there on the back table, reading through the Bible, and we're going to be finishing up sometime in the next month or so. We're in the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel is in the Old Testament, like I said. There are some interesting things going on in this book, but we're only going to take a couple of snapshots in the next couple of weeks just to get a feel for what's going on in this book as we read through it. So as we come to this week's particular story, first off, who is Daniel? Daniel was a prophet. Daniel was among the refugees who were deported from Jerusalem when King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the emperor in Babylon, when he sacks Jerusalem. He destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and deports people. Now, we've seen this. We were in the book of Isaiah, we were in the book of Jeremiah, we were in the book of Ezekiel. And Jeremiah was one who was deported at that time. Ezekiel's the one who was deported at that time. Jeremiah ends up in Egypt. Ezekiel ends up in Babylon. We don't know whether Daniel and Ezekiel knew each other. The one thing we do know is that Daniel was quite a bit younger. Most likely he was an older teenager when he was deported to Babylon. What we also know about Daniel, 3 buddies who are also part of nobility. Whether or not they're actually part of the royal family, we don't know, but we know they had those connections. They were very smart, those 4 guys. And they had to Babylon. In fact, it's one of the early deportations before Jerusalem was even destroyed. And immediately, they're tapped. See, one thing about Nebuchadnezzar that was a little different as an emperor, he tried to take the best and wanted to take the best from Israel to help him run his kingdom. Especially if you have all these refugees. You need help with them. So these guys become economic advisors to Nebuchadnezzar. So they're kind of, they're in this orbit. It's not, Henry just read this little snippet, and they're having this conversation with Nebuchadnezzar. It's not like these were just 4 unknowns, or 3 unknowns in that story. We'll get to that in a second. It's not like they're unknown. And they're helping him run the country. They're that good. So we know these 3 best friends. They had Hebrew names, but we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The book of Daniel is about these 4 guys. In fact, the stories kind of trace what these 4 guys are doing, Daniel and his 3 friends. And throughout the book, God is using Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. And it might be one of the more fascinating things about the book of Daniel, and even all the stuff that goes down in Daniel, is typically when God is dealing with pagan kings, like King Pharaoh. King Pharaoh, hundreds of years earlier, when he's enslaving the Israelites and God rescues the Israelites out of Egypt, God just puts Pharaoh at the bottom of the Red Sea. For some reason, and we're not really given the reason, God decides that he's going to work with Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, it becomes very obvious that he's actually after Nebuchadnezzar's heart. He gets very, very personal with Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, every story in the early part of Daniel is somehow, some way, God is having some personal interaction with this pagan king who has deported his people to Babylon. Again, we're not told why, but God has decided that he wants Nebuchadnezzar to be part of this story. He gets very personal with Nebuchadnezzar. The problem with Nebuchadnezzar becomes very evident beginning with the 1st chapter, and then the 2nd chapter, 3rd chapter, which we're in, 4th chapter, 5th chapter, is that Nebuchadnezzar believes that he is self-made. mean, after all, he's the ruler of the world. You don't question him. In terms of humanity, he's omnipotent. He can do anything he wants. He's got the best military in the world. Even Egypt, not going to mess with Nebuchadnezzar. And the statements that he's making to these Hebrew teenagers and young adults are, this is me. I did this. See all this? I did this. In fact, you look at your history books, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are considered one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. He's the one that put all that together. And in his interactions is, I did this. I am self-made. None of you would be here without me. I'm the greatest in the world. I am bigger, better, stronger, and Babylon has me to thank. Well, this is a running theme in Daniel, because Nebuchadnezzar doesn't just go at this once. He's going at it multiple times because he's not learning his lesson. So, beginning with chapter 2, and then running through the rest of the book, is this. Nebuchadnezzar, you're not self-made. God gave you all this. And God says, look, I'm the one who gave you the power. Yes, you've got a pretty big military. You couldn't do any of that without me. You're not self-made. The theme of Daniel, then, is the Most High, who is God himself, rules over all the kingdoms of the world, not Nebuchadnezzar. And that anything that Nebuchadnezzar does rule, God gave it to him. It's all a gift. It's all a gift. Everything King Nebuchadnezzar has is a gift. A gift from the guy who is ruling it all, God himself. But you get to chapter 3, and Nebuchadnezzar is saying, nope. He's not buying any of it. We get to chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar sets up this huge image in the middle of nowhere, a gold image that's 90 feet high. So it's at least 7 or 8 stories tall. That's a big image. Something that you can see for a long way. He throws a big party. He invites all the A-listers. They all come. Anybody who is anybody in Babylon shows up. Gave me everything. I don't need whatever Daniel and his friends are talking about. We're going to have a party. We're going to worship this thing. So they have the music. They have the band. They have the A-list band. It says that when you hear the band playing, everybody hit your knees. And the text says everybody did. Except for 3 guys. Now, we don't know where Daniel was at this time. Probably someplace in another part of the kingdom doing something else at the time. But you got these 3. His 3 friends. They're brought before the king, and they make this amazing confession. Here's what they say. If the God that we serve exists, then he can rescue us. Nebuchadnezzar is threatening to throw them into this fiery furnace. In fact, he threatened everybody. If anybody doesn't bow, you get the fiery furnace. And they're saying, if the God we serve exists, he can rescue us from that furnace of blazing fire. And he can rescue us from your power, the king. But even if he doesn't rescue us, we want you as king to know we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. Now, an important thing here, part of the myth busting is they're saying, we want you as king to know we're not going to serve your gods, we're not going to worship or bow down. But they don't go on to this long diatribe. They don't get into why all this stuff is going on. And a lot of times we import things here about them taking a stand, about how wrong Nebuchadnezzar is. They're not even saying he's wrong here. All they're saying is, we're not doing this. Now, the implication is that they think he's wrong. But there's no real defiance of Nebuchadnezzar other than we're just not going to bow. And 3 times they use that word rescue. It's all about rescue. They understand that their God can rescue, could rescue. They don't know if he's going to rescue. But that word then comes through. The first one. God can rescue us from the furnace of the blazing fire. They're convinced. They know the stories. They know the stories of David and Goliath. They know the stories of Israel and the Red Sea. You know what? God could rescue us from the furnace. He could choose to do that. Our God is a rescuer. And not only can he rescue us from the furnace, the second thing is he can rescue us from you. Who's the real problem here, right? He can rescue us from your power. Because he's bigger. Back to this idea that God is bigger than you. And then the third thing, even if he doesn't rescue us, we're not about to embrace what you're selling. Another gospel. You see, everything that they're saying that's coming out of their mouth is about faith. They have faith that God can rescue. And they have faith in God even if he doesn't rescue. That's an amazing faith. So the king's response is not surprising. The text there uses rage. And he goes into this rage. He has the furnace fired up 7 times hotter than it was. And he throws the 3 friends into the fire. He's going to make them an example. And since they're worshiping gods, there were probably sacrifices. It says they were bound, so he's making them just another part of the sacrifice. They become sacrifices to this God. If you're going to defy me, if you're not going to worship this God, well, I'm going to make you a sacrifice to this God. And it's so hot, 7 times hotter, that we see 3 of his guys die throwing the 3 in. But God is not done with Nebuchadnezzar. The story doesn't end right there. In fact, we know how this ends, but it becomes very easy for this to be some morality tale, like we should always follow God, we should always obey God, and good things will happen. That is not what is happening here. That is not the promise that is being made here. God is not done with the 3 friends. He's not done with Nebuchadnezzar. After throwing the 3 friends into the furnace, he jumps out of his chair. Didn't we throw 3 men into the fire bound? Of course. I see 4 men here, not tied, walking around in the fire. First of all, there's no denying the miracle here. In fact, the miracle here, again, is quite apparent because 3 guys died putting these guys into the furnace. We're also told, as Henry read, that their hair and their clothes weren't singed, the hair wasn't singed, which tells us that 4th individual was already in the furnace when they were thrown in. There's no smell of fire on them. There's been no fire on them at all. And Nebuchadnezzar has out some good men. But again, that's not the real story. Remember, the theme of Daniel is the Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world, and he gifts those kingdoms to men. And so we get this. Nebuchadnezzar says, I see 4 people. He threw 3 in, but there's now a 4th. The 4th figure in the fire is the very God that he's been interacting with through Daniel and his 3 friends. The 4th person is God himself. You see, the Most High isn't simply a ruler. He doesn't just simply throw edicts around from the heavens at a distance. He is in the fire. This is another example of the angel of the Lord coming and personally rescuing his people. And he is personally engaging Nebuchadnezzar. This isn't some distant God who stands off to the side and says, hey, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that. And it's not a God that's just simply stepping aside and says, oh, I think I'm going to rescue those people today, and I'm going to turn the volume down on the fire. No. Our God comes and he joins them in the fire. He becomes part of the story. He personally rescues. He is personally with those three friends. You see, the Most High personally rules over the world. He rules over the kingdoms of men. He personally gifts those kingdoms to people. You know, the rulers of the world, even today, God is still at it. He's not operating from a distance. And the reality is, the Most High, who is orchestrating the entire story, is all about being personal, being real, being with us. That's why our story is in this Bible. I mean, this is the same angel of the Lord. I mean, we're talking about fire today. You can't miss this. This is the same angel of the Lord that showed up to Moses in the burning bush, and the bush didn't burn up. So here we have another instance where this is all happening again. And even with Moses, the angel of the Lord is telling Moses, God himself is saying, hey, I am about to rescue my people out of Egypt. And he shows up that day with Nebuchadnezzar and those three guys, and he says, you know what? I'm going to personally save these people from this fire. But all of that is setting us up to understand that there is coming a time, and it would be hundreds of years after this all happens, that he is going to personally show up as a baby in a manger, and he is going to come into our fire, and he's going to be with us, and then he's going to die for us. But he's going to do it in a very personal way. And as we read, the promise after this time on earth is done is, I'm always going to be with you. Because this God, this Jesus, is not detached. It is very, very easy for us when we're going through whatever fire it is, and a lot of times that fire does have to do with whatever it is we think about our salvation. But whatever fire it is, we can begin to think that God is just out there. Does he hear me? Is he with me? Is he even really interested in what I'm going through? And the answer is absolutely. And we can go to this story, and we can stand there with Nebuchadnezzar looking inside and see, you know what? There's the fourth guy. I see four people. That fourth person is always with us. He never leaves us. And that story is telling us that. That the one who does control all things, the one who is the ruler of the world, the one who does rule the universe, is so interested in me, so loves me, and so gives me so much grace that he is willing to enter my fire with me. We actually said it this morning. Everybody asked this about this phrase in our creed. And it's a fascinating conversation, and you know what? It gets real technical real fast. What is our Apostles' Creed, the one that we say every so often? He descended into hell. What does that mean? And we're not going to answer that this morning, right? But what I can tell you is that Christ did descend into hell. Just think about this. When he leaves heaven to come as a baby, he is leaving the glory of heaven. He's leaving what's ever perfect for him. And he's entering this. He's entering this. He's entering a world of pain. He's entering a world of suffering. He's entering a world of our sin, our mistakes. He's entering a world where we're constantly defiant. We're not listening. We're not paying attention. He came into our world. That's hell for him. He descends to be with us in our fire to rescue us. But there's also this. That fourth person, when he comes and he makes his home with us, he dies so that we can live through the fire. He dies so that to rescue us from sin, death, and the devil. So, that's what this story is mainly about. Now, you'll hear, if you get on the internet, you'll find all sorts of things about what is really going on with Daniel, or Daniel's 3 friends, and this big fire. And I kind of got irritated after a while. Story after story, and theologian after theologian talking about God being sovereign, which is true. That is a running theme in Daniel. But when he enters the fire, he is no longer simply a theoretical. It's not simply theology. God is sovereign, but he is sovereign personally. He is with us in flesh and blood. The other thing here that you'll hear from time to time is that 4th person showed up in the fire to save those guys because they did good. Because they were really something. Nowhere in Daniel 3 does it say that. And when they're standing there saying, you know what, he doesn't have to rescue us, he might not rescue us, that was true. They didn't know. He's not doing this as a reward. He is doing it for them out of grace. He's doing it for Nebuchadnezzar out of grace. Because Nebuchadnezzar, again, is the one who's been saying, I'm self-made. And this right here, this 4th person in the fire with those 3 guys is a reminder, you know what? You're not in charge. You're not self-made. And I'm personally rescuing my people. This is about the God who rescues, the God who saves, the God who is to be believed. So, I invite you, whatever you're going through, at any given point, to come back to the fire and stand there with Nebuchadnezzar and just look at who's with those 3 guys and just remind yourself that 4th person in the fire is there for you. Always. Don't ever forget it. I mean, this becomes a running theme throughout the Bible. Why? Because, again, we're about to celebrate this in just a couple of months. But this whole idea of God descending from heaven into earth as a baby in a manger is all about this 4th person in the fire taking that step and entering our world to be with us because he loves us so much. He comes to die for us. You see, this 4th person is somebody who rescues. This 4th person is somebody who saves. This 4th person, the Fire King, is somebody who forgives. And we get absolutely no negative. I find it interesting when those 3 guys walked out that the writer of Daniel, and certainly this was being said by the guys that were all watching this, including Nebuchadnezzar, they didn't even smell like fire. Do you know that when God looks at you, he doesn't smell any of your sin? You understand that? When God looks at